Hey everybody, welcome to episode 83 of the Askdap show, where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. On this episode, we talk about modding a lease vehicle, DSG services that are too expensive, and upgrading the brakes on your car.
The Sean SC via YouTube says, I was told when I bought my Mark 7R that I could get a rental for free. My new service manager basically picked a fight over me for $35. When I picked up my car, he was super nice and wanted me to do a survey. Called him out on it. It was like, you picked a fight, now you want a good survey? I laughed at him and walked out.
All right, so this actually was not as much of a question as it was a comment, but it was on the video that I shot I think it was last Askdap. They talked about VW dealers and kind of the employees and asking if they're all terrible. So this was a kind of a response to that, and I wanted to share a few things about this because I thought it would be some interesting insights. First of all, I have absolutely not defending that service manager at all. Obviously, I think he handled it completely improperly. But just to give people a little bit of context about kind of what my perspective as to what that was and why that even happened. It's very, very common for salespeople to promise things that they have no business promising to customers. Mostly it's because salespeople, as a general rule, not just in VW dealers, but actually in the entire industry, people who sell cars tend to not have roots where they are. They turn over very quickly. VW, actually, my guess would be is most VW dealers probably tend to keep people a little bit longer because it is kind of an enthusiast brand. And so they get some salespeople actually like the cars, like the product, so they stick longer. But as a general rule, salespeople actually rotate pretty quickly, and oftentimes salespeople actually don't care about what they say and make promises that they have no intention of keeping, or don't even know if they can keep, frankly. It's not even that they're malicious, it's that they just don't even care enough to know whether what they're saying actually is true or not. They make promises that are empty. So most likely that's why the promise was empty, saying, hey, every single time you come in here, we're going to make sure we get you a loaner car, blah, 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 and that type of stuff. So whenever you get stuff like that, most people don't realize that dealerships, while you look at a dealership and you see one business, it's whatever VW, blah, 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 VW. What it is separate individual departments within that dealership, and they all operate individually. While they're obviously closely tied together, they're separate businesses. So when the sales manager promises something, he's not going to be paying for the loaner that you're going to get for, let's say, your bulb out. You know, some people, maybe they want to just go in, go out, you know, your bulb is out and you want to get taken care of and you don't want to have to wait around. A lot of times that expectation is going to be different, and you're not going to get a loaner car for a bulb out or an oil change or something like that. And the salespeople in those situations will oftentimes set an expectation that is not going to be fulfilled by the service department, because frankly that's just not how they operate, and they can't have 60 loaner cars at all times that are just sitting there waiting for somebody who needs an oil change and doesn't want to wait for 30 or 40 minutes to give it out to them. So hopefully that sheds a little bit of light on that subject. And again, while I think it was handled improperly, I just wanted to give a little bit of a context as to why I think it kind of happened in the first place.
PFD via YouTube says, what mods can you do with a lease performance-wise?
All right, so what mods can you do with a lease? So technically, a lease car doesn't belong to you. So modifying a car that doesn't belong to you, technically the answer would be none. My general perspective is anything that's reversible is something you could do. You have to be aware that obviously there are warranty implications around doing stuff to the vehicle. So if you want to make sure you're not voiding your warranty, you know, I'll link to some of the videos where I've talked a lot about warranty stuff on new vehicles and modification in the description, where you can check that out, because I've had multiple discussions over a long period of time about that subject. But essentially, the car is leased, so anything you do to the car should be fairly easily reversible. That's going to vary depending on your level and comfort of working on vehicles, whether you're going to be able to do it yourself or pay somebody to do it. My guess is, by the book, there's probably zero you're allowed to do to the car, because it doesn't belong to you, and modifying a car that doesn't belong to you is probably not something that VW Credit or VCI would be super happy about. And again, you know, to me, handing back, as long as you're turning back the car in the same condition you got it in, then that wouldn't be an issue, and generally is going to be overlooked on lease inspections anyway. Really on lease turn-ins, they're looking for damage and worn tires and worn brakes and kind of this stuff that's going to prevent them from being able to sell the car, or a cost they're going to have to incur to repair it to make it sellable. That's really what they're looking for on lease turn-in. So hopefully that sheds a little bit of light on that subject, and good luck and happy modding.
Heath Brown via email says, I recently spoke with a VW service advisor at a local dealership which is mod friendly. I was asking about my brake system and installing aftermarket stainless steel brake lines with a caliper stiffening kit, and he stated that the cars already come with stainless steel brake lines and that unless it's going with a big brake kit, the aftermarket ones would be overkill for my needs. Also, that flushing out the old fluid with Motul 5.1 brake fluid at my 30K service wouldn't be necessary either. I still have a lot of brake life left in my pads and rotors, so I was only looking at those modifications to help with braking performance. What's your thoughts on this? Would upgrading to these components help?
Okay, Heath. So you were advised that the vehicle doesn't need that stuff, stainless lines and all that stuff, because it already has it. That is not accurate. Your vehicle does not have stainless steel braided lines. And let's talk a little bit about fluid. Upgrading your fluid is going to raise the boiling point of the fluid, which means you'll have less issues around braking related to fluid when you're under heavy performance situations. Upgrading your fluid is not really a necessity until you get into that realm. People who do track days or track their car, or SCCA events or that type of stuff, or even if you have a lot of spirited braking on like back roads and you do maybe like long runs on back roads, that might be worth upgrading your brake fluid. As far as stainless lines and the stiffening kit for the calipers, I would say that's going to be more about feel, pedal feel, and braking and how kind of the pedal feel interacts when you brake, because obviously when you add the stainless lines and you add the stiffening kit, there's a lot less give. When you hit that pedal, there's going to be a lot less initial give, which just changes the pedal feel and gives you more kind of an immediate reaction to braking. The one thing I want to touch on is if you want better braking, those components are probably not going to get you there. I would say upgrading pads specifically, or pads and rotors, are going to be a much more wise investment into getting you better braking than those other things. Those other things are kind of a good addition to it, but they're not really going to necessarily get you better braking, better feel around braking, and prevent fade and that type of stuff. But keep in mind, if you upgrade, if you have issues around, let's say, if you're concerned that because of heavy braking scenarios, you're concerned about your brake fluid, stock pads are not going to be sufficient to hold up to high heat situations anyway. And so not upgrading those, but upgrading the other things is not going to be a kind of a net result. There will be benefits to it, don't get me wrong. And pedal feel is going to be better regardless of what the situations you use them in. But my advice would be to upgrade them both. And something that maybe consider is, if you upgrade now, you can always keep your factory stuff if it's good before it's bad, so that you can always flip back to it at a later date if you decide you want to either go back to stock or put them back in the car. And once you go through the performance brakes, that's really a matter of preference. But if you're looking to upgrade brakes, my advice would be pads and rotors, and then go the route of those things, because that will actually get you increased braking. Again, if you're tracking the car, fluid's kind of an important part of that, and then stainless lines and stiffening would kind of be the latter things that I would personally recommend. Although there are benefits, I think that the other components are actually going to get you more of a net result that's better for actual braking itself.
Freddie Gump via YouTube says, why is dealer service the most expensive? I found that the DSG service on my Mark 6 cost $200 more than even a large independent shop that provided equivalent service and perks to customers. And does the service department carry the dealership? I know new car markup isn't as big as most people assume, and I've heard this rumor that the service is often more profitable than sales.
Okay, so there's a lot to kind of unpack in this one. Let's start with talking about pricing around service. Pricing and service is really going to be subjective because it's going to vary depending on the market and the dealer and a lot of other factors. So our dealer is more expensive. I would say on average they are probably more expensive in most cases, and especially starting now because most dealers are smartening up and recognizing that being competitive is important. I would say most dealers are going to be pretty close to what you would find a quality independent shop. There's that kind of the old joke that there's like an old sign that says a cheap mechanic is the most expensive mechanic you can ever have. And I've found that to be true. I've had plenty of people who, they take their car that has electronic rear parking brakes in for brakes at some like Jiffy Lube or, some sort of tire shop or whatever, and they end up breaking their rear calipers on their car because the pistons have to be retracted and they don't really know what they're doing, and so they end up breaking your rear calipers. So that's one thing. They do tend to be more expensive. I think on average they give you a better value because you're getting people who are trained, who know the vehicles better and are well versed in what they're working on. The one thing that I think people don't understand is when you see just that sticker number on the door that says the labor rate, that does not necessarily mean that the aftermarket shops can be cheaper, because what ends up happening sometimes is some aftermarket shops have a cheaper labor rate, but because they're less familiar with the cars, they charge more hours for labor, and so the 1-to-1 ratio isn't always the same. Now, that's probably not going to be true with services. Maintenance services and stuff like that are probably going to be pretty close, and again, maybe even erring on the side of the aftermarket shop. And the other piece of this is that if you're in bigger markets, especially major metro markets like tri-state area, Southern California, South Florida, maybe Chicago, some Texas stores, these are some really big markets for VW. And so I would imagine that some of those dealers actually indeed do charge way more than they should relative to the market. And because they kind of have a captive audience, they choose to do so, and they just don't care about the people they alienate. That's not my personal opinion. I would never choose that as a business plan. I think that's a poor choice because eventually you're going to lose people regardless if you're taking advantage of them and charging them way more for the same exact service. But again, keep in mind, it's not always one-to-one. So that's kind of that subject. I would say $200 more for a DSG service. Something is off about that. Either they're way overcharging or you're not comparing apples to apples. So something to consider when you're pricing that out. But I would definitely say $200 more is too much, and there is not a value for a $200 difference in a DSG service. Most DSG services should not be anywhere near that expensive. Then, in regards to talking about service departments and dealerships. So yes, as you mentioned, most people think that dealerships are making an arm and a leg because you buy a $30,000 or $40,000 car from them. They are not. Dealerships do not generally make a lot of margin on new vehicles, especially some on used, but not much on new. Sometimes they have some rebates and stuff back from the manufacturers, but it's not a huge significant number. And actually, I can tell you from spending a lot of time in dealers that when you factor in the immense advertising costs that most dealerships spend on the sales end of things, a lot of sales departments are actually net loser by the time you factor in all those costs, by the time they pay people, advertising, all that stuff. So yes, service departments often are one of the main profit centers for dealerships because obviously it is a labor business where they have pretty solid margins generally. And that really depends on the philosophy of the dealer group, because I actually know a good friend of mine runs some dealerships in Jersey, non-VW ones, and that dealer group has a sales philosophy. They care way more about sales than they do about service, and so I know in that group the service departments are not as high performing as what you would generally find, because when you have people who own those dealerships who focus on the sales side more and maximizing that, then that's going to be kind of the direction that everything falls in. And there are still some kind of people who are of that mindset of that sales side is the most important, and that is kind of the effort they make for profit generation. But I think most of the industry has transitioned to where service is looking to have at least a good amount of coverage of the total expenses of the dealership kind of covered with that situation. Hopefully I answered your question and shed some light on that subject for you. Thank you so much for watching episode 83 of the Askdap Show, where we answer your Volkswagen Audi questions. If you have any questions or comments about the questions answered in this show, be sure to leave in the comments below. If you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more like it.